It is just past noon on June 28, 1971, and Columbus Circle in the middle of Manhattan is alive with the sound of tens of thousands of voices. Italian flags snap in the summer breeze. Banners, stretched between lampposts, read Italian-American Civil Rights League. Children sit on their fathers' shoulders. Women in summer dresses fan themselves with rally programs. And standing on a raised wooden platform, just yards from the main monument, at the edge of Central Park, a 48-year-old man in a dark suit is smiling at the largest crowd of his life. His name is Joe Colombo. He is the boss of one of the most powerful crime families in America, and he has just finished telling tens of thousands of people that the word mafia is a slur. He does not know it yet, but he has approximately 90 seconds to live the life he has known. In the time it takes a man to walk from a microphone to the edge of a stage, perhaps 15 steps, no more than 10 or 12 seconds, a 25-year-old from New Jersey with a camera around his neck will raise a handgun, fire 3 shots at point-blank range into Joe Colombo's head and neck, and be cut down by bodyguards before the echo dies. 5 seconds of gunfire, 7 years of paralysis. And more than 50 years later, we still do not know who sent him. But here is what makes this case different from every other mob hit in American history. Joe Colombo did not die that day. He did not die that week. He did not die that year. He would live for almost 7 more years, paralyzed and almost completely silent, kept alive in a Brooklyn bedroom, while every man who might have ordered his murder was either killed, indicted, or buried. So who really ordered the hit on Joe Colombo? Was it the rival within his own family, Crazy Joe Gallo, freshly released from a decade in prison and hungry to take back what he believed was his? Was it the quiet, untouchable Carlo Gambino, embarrassed by Colombo's loud public crusade? Or was it something stranger? Federal agencies who saw Colombo's civil rights movement as a threat they could not legally remove. More than 50 years later, the answer is still contested, and there is something stranger still. The shooter, a young black man named Jerome Johnson, described by police as a gun buff and an admirer of Hitler, had no clear connection to anyone. He was killed seconds after firing. He left no statement, no diary, no confession. He is the only witness who could have told us the truth, and he was silenced before he hit the ground. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what happened in those 10 seconds at Columbus Circle and why this single public shooting may be the most carefully unsolved murder in modern American crime history. If you are fascinated by the untold stories of America's most baffling crime mysteries, hit that like button and subscribe right now for more deep dive investigations into the cases history never fully explained. Now, let me take you back to a Brooklyn neighborhood in 1938, where this story really begins. Joe Colombo was 15 years old when his father's body was found. Anthony Colombo had been a soldier in the Profaki crime family, and in 1938 someone, no one ever proved who, strangled him to death and left him in a parked car. The Colombo boys grew up in a Brooklyn where their father's killers walked the same streets. That is the kind of childhood that does not produce accountants. Joe enlisted in the United States Coast Guard during World War II, but he did not last. After a nervous breakdown, he was discharged, and he came home to Brooklyn the way thousands of young men came home in 1945, restless, hardened, and looking for an angle. He found one. By the 1950s, he was bookmaking, loan sharking and running rackets for the same Profaki family that had likely buried his father. By 1964, after a bloody internal war and a series of unexpected deaths, the Mafia Commission, the closest thing the underworld had to a board of directors, installed Joe Colombo as boss of his own family. He was 41 years old. And here is where Joe Colombo became something the American Mafia had never produced before. By the late 1960s, federal investigators were swarming the 5 families, wiretaps, grand juries, front-page indictments. Every other boss in New York responded by going deeper into the shadows. Joe Colombo did the opposite. In the spring of 1970, he stood up in public and announced that he was forming a civil rights organization, the Italian-American Civil Rights League. Its stated purpose to fight discrimination against Italian Americans and specifically to force the United States government to stop using the word mafia, a mob boss, leading a civil rights movement against the mafia. And here is the part that complicates everything. The tens of thousands of people who came to his rallies were not gangsters. They were ordinary Italian Americans, bakers from Bensonhurst, plumbers from Newark, school teachers from Queens, who had spent their lives watching their grandfathers and uncles and sons portrayed in newspapers and movies as criminals. They wanted someone to speak for them. And Joe Colombo, of all people, was the one with the microphone. They did not know, or did not want to know, that the man defending their dignity was the same man whose family ran loan sharks and stolen goods rings on the streets they lived on. That contradiction is what would kill him. The first Italian Unity Day rally happened on June 29, 1970, at the same Columbus Circle where Colombo would later be shot. The crowd estimates ranged from 20,000 to 50,000. Frank Sinatra sent a donation. Sammy Davis Jr. performed. The League's membership swelled into the tens of thousands across chapters in the Northeast. Picket lines appeared outside the Federal Bureau of Investigation's New York field office. Stickers reading Italian Power went up on car bumpers from Staten Island to Newark. The federal agency was forced to remove the words Mafia and La Cosa Nostra from its press releases. Joe Colombo had won. And in winning, he had made enemies he could not see. The other bosses of the five families watched all of this with growing fury. Carlo Gambino, 69 years old in 1971, was the most powerful of them, a Sicilian-born man who had spent his entire career as the opposite of Joe Colombo. Gambino did not give speeches. He did not stand on stages. He did not appear in newspapers. He ate quietly in Brooklyn social clubs and gave orders through 3 layers of intermediaries. To Gambino, what Joe Colombo was doing was not just embarrassing. It was dangerous. Every rally drew federal attention to the entire underworld. Every speech put words in the mouths of men who were supposed to be invisible. But the most dangerous enemy was already inside Colombo's own house. His name was Joey Gallo. They called him Crazy Joe. He was 42 years old in 1971, freshly released from prison after serving nearly 10 years for extortion. While he was inside, Gallo had become something strange for a mob soldier. He read philosophy. He read James Baldwin. He cultivated friendships with black inmates that he carried with him back to the streets. After his release in 1970, he was seen dining at Sardi's in Manhattan, hosting actors and writers, building a public persona as the intellectual gangster. But underneath the books and the dinners, he had not forgotten what he believed, that the Colombo family throne was supposed to be his. And here is the dramatic irony that the historical record makes impossible to ignore. Joey Gallo, the mob captain who had spent a decade in prison learning to speak the language of Black America, who told friends he understood the civil rights movement better than any boss in New York, would later be accused of hiring a young black man to murder the only mafia boss who had built his power on the language of civil rights. Whether or not Gallo really did it, the symmetry is almost too perfect to be coincidence. In his rallies, Joe Colombo spoke like a man who had found his calling. He told the crowds that Italian Americans were being persecuted by the federal government and federal prosecutors who label us all mafia. He promised that the League would fight to remove that word from the American vocabulary. His supporters cheered. His enemies, the federal agents, the rival bosses, the Gallo loyalists, watched and waited. By the spring of 1971, sources inside the federal agencies were telling reporters off the record that the League was nothing more than a sophisticated front to intimidate witnesses and shame investigators. They were not entirely wrong. But they were not entirely right either, because the people in the crowd, the bakers, the school teachers, the grandmothers, were not pretending. Their grievance was real, even if the man channeling it was not who he claimed to be. In early 1971, the League announced its second Italian Unity Day rally. Same date as a year before. Same place. Columbus Circle. Permits were filed. A stage was commissioned. Sound systems were tested. Chartered buses were arranged through Italian-American social clubs across New York and New Jersey. And inside the federal agencies and the New York Police Department, intelligence sources began to whisper a single repeating phrase: "Someone is going to try to kill him." What did Joe Colombo know? Did he know that the commission had discussed his fate in a Brooklyn back room? Did he know that Joey Gallo, his rival from inside his own family, had been seen meeting with figures from outside the traditional mob? Did he know that federal investigators had warned at least one of his associates that they had heard the word contract in connection with his name? The historical record does not give us a clean answer, but it gives us this. In the weeks before the rally, Joe Colombo was warned more than once, by more than one source, that he should not appear in public. The exact conversation has been described different ways by different sources, but the substance is consistent. Sometime in the days before June 28, 1971, men close to Colombo, his lieutenants, possibly his sons, possibly his attorneys, sat him down and told him not to go to the rally. The warning was not vague. They had heard chatter. They had heard names. They believed someone was going to make a move at Columbus Circle, in broad daylight, in front of cameras. Joe Colombo refused. He had spent 2 years building the League. He had spent 2 years convincing tens of thousands of Italian Americans that he was the man who would stand up for them. To miss the second rally, the rally that would prove the first was not a fluke, would be to give up everything he had built. It would tell his enemies he was afraid. It would tell his supporters he was a fraud. He had reframed himself in front of an entire country. He could not unreframe himself now. Whether he literally said the words, "I am going," or whether his decision came in some quieter, more fatalistic moment, the emotional truth is the same. He looked at the warning. He looked at the rally. He looked at what he had become. And he chose the stage. It is the choice of a man who already understood that there was no version of his life that ended quietly. The only question left was when and where, and in front of how many people. The morning of June 28, 1971, broke clear and warm over Manhattan. The buses were already rolling. The banners were already going up, and somewhere in New Jersey, a 25-year-old man was putting on a press photographer's outfit, picking up a camera and slipping a handgun into his bag. By 8 in the morning on June 28, 1971, Columbus Circle was already changing. New York Police Department barriers went up along the perimeter. League marshals, most of them young men in pressed suits, many of them low-level Colombo associates with no formal law enforcement authority, moved into position around the central plaza. The stage rose against the south face of the main monument, a granite memorial to sailors who had died in 1898, now serving as a backdrop for a mob boss's civil rights speech. Sound checks echoed across the empty pavement. By 10, the first buses were arriving from New Jersey, from Long Island, from upstate. By 11, the crowd had begun to thicken. By noon, it was an ocean. It was a hot day. Late June in Manhattan, with the kind of humidity that settles into a man's shirt collar and stays there. Children pressed against the barricades. Old men in straw hats stood on the curb. Italian-American social clubs unfurled their banners. A brass band played somewhere near the edge of Central Park. The smell of street food, sausages, peppers, salted pretzels, drifted across the pavement, and undercover officers and federal agents moved through the crowd in plain clothes, watching faces, watching hands, watching the platform where Joe Colombo would soon stand. Joe Colombo arrived sometime around midday. He came with a tight cordon of bodyguards, Colombo family soldiers who were armed and authorized to be armed, walking shoulder to shoulder with him from his car to the stage. He shook hands, he smiled, he waved at supporters, he climbed onto the platform, took the microphone, and began to speak. And here is the detail that nearly every account of this day either skips over or gets wrong. Joe Colombo, on the morning he was shot, was relaxed. He was happy. Witnesses near the stage later described him as cheerful, even joking with his associates, basking in the size of the crowd. He had been warned. He had been told. And he stood there smiling anyway. This is not the body language of a man who believes he is about to die. This is the body language of a man who has decided, somewhere deep down, that he is untouchable. That belief is what is about to kill him. Somewhere in that crowd, moving quietly toward the stage, was a 25-year-old man named Jerome A. Johnson. He had come in from New Jersey. He was wearing the kind of clothes a working press photographer might wear. He was carrying a camera. Around his neck, perhaps, were credentials of some kind. Accounts differ on whether they were real, forged, or simply assumed by the marshals who let him pass. He was a young black man in a crowd that was overwhelmingly Italian-American, and yet no one stopped him, because the crowd was full of press. Columbia Broadcasting System cameras were there. National Broadcasting Company crews were there. Local New York stations were there. Freelancers and stringers worked the perimeter looking for the shot. Jerome Johnson, camera raised, looked like one of them. What we know about Jerome Johnson can be summarized in a handful of sentences. He was 25 years old. He lived in New Jersey. The police would later describe him as a gun buff and an admirer of Hitler, words that suggested extremist leanings, an unstable psychology, a man drawn to violence for its own sake. Some sources, written years later, would claim that he was a low-level associate of the Colombo family who had been recruited by Joey Gallo. Other sources would suggest he was a freelance killer, a man someone had paid for a job. And a few would whisper, in the years that followed, that he was something stranger, an asset, a pawn, a tool of forces that had nothing to do with the mob. But on the morning of June 28, 1971, none of that mattered. What mattered was that he was standing within a few feet of the 48-year-old boss, with a handgun in his bag, and no one had stopped him. Joe Colombo spoke for several minutes. The exact words of that final speech do not survive in full transcription, but its themes were the same themes he had been hammering for 2 years. Italian Americans were being persecuted by the federal government. The word mafia was a slur. The League would continue to fight. The crowd cheered. Camera shutters clicked. And down at the base of the stage, in the open space between the platform and the front row of the crowd, Jerome Johnson stood waiting. What you have to understand if you want to understand what happens next is how close everyone was to everyone else. The stage at Columbus Circle was not a fortified speakers platform. It was a low wooden riser, the kind of structure used at neighborhood block parties. The distance from the microphone to the front of the crowd was perhaps 15 feet. The distance from where Joe Colombo would step down to where Jerome Johnson was standing was, by the best estimates we have, less than the length of a parked car. In a crowd of tens of thousands, the killer and the target were close enough to hear each other breathe. Joe Colombo finished his remarks. He turned away from the microphone. He waved to the crowd one last time, and he began to walk toward the steps that would carry him down off the platform and into the open space below. His bodyguards moved with him. The marshals nearby tightened their cordon. Cameras swung to follow him. The crowd surged forward to shake his hand. And Jerome Johnson, standing exactly where he had been standing for the last 15 minutes, lifted his camera one more time. But this time, he did not take a picture. What happened in the next 10 seconds would be argued about for the next 50 years. But the basic sequence, the 3 shots, the bodyguards' return fire, the screaming, the blood on the pavement at Columbus Circle, would be over before most of the crowd even understood what they had just witnessed. The clock is somewhere between 12:30 and 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Joe Colombo is taking the final steps of his life as he has known it. He moves toward the edge of the platform with the easy confidence of a man who has done this 100 times. He smiles. He nods at supporters in the front row. The marshals around him part to give him a path down the wooden steps. Camera shutters click in rapid succession from every angle. professional photographers, freelancers, family members holding personal cameras up over the heads of the crowd. The sound is constant, like rain on a tin roof. Below him, in the open space at the bottom of the steps, Jerome Johnson is in position. He is calm. Witnesses who would later try to reconstruct his behavior from the seconds before the shooting would describe him as composed. A young man holding a camera, doing what dozens of other young men with cameras were doing. He is not jittery. He is not sweating visibly. He is not pacing. He is simply standing where he needs to stand, doing what he needs to do to look like everyone around him. This is the moment when the entire history of the next 50 years comes down to a single question. How did a 25-year-old from New Jersey, alone or with backing, manage to put himself within arm's length of the most public mafia boss in America, at the most public event of that mafia boss's life, surrounded by bodyguards, surrounded by police, surrounded by federal agents, and not be stopped? The simple answer is that nobody was looking for a black man with a camera. The Colombo family's security model was built around the assumption that any threat would come from Italian Americans. Johnson did not fit the profile they were searching for, and so the profile let him through. Joe Colombo reaches the top of the steps. He pauses for one final wave. He begins to descend. Joe Colombo's foot touches the pavement at the bottom of the platform. He smiles at someone in the front row. His bodyguards are close, within arm's reach, but they are watching the crowd in front of him, not the camera at his side. Jerome Johnson lifts his right hand. The camera he has been carrying for the last hour falls or shifts. In its place, in the same motion, a small handgun appears. The witnesses who would later try to reconstruct this moment would describe it as so fast that some of them simply did not see the gun. They saw a flash. They heard the crack. There is a particular sound a handgun makes when it is fired at point-blank range in open air, surrounded by tens of thousands of human bodies. It is not the cinematic boom of an action movie. It is sharper, flatter, more like a heavy book slammed against a desk, and it carries, because there is nothing to absorb it, no walls, no curtains, just stone and pavement and panic. In the plaza at Columbus Circle on June 28, 1971, that sound came 3 times. The first bullet strikes Joe Colombo near the right side of his head. Accounts vary as to whether it enters near the eye, the temple, or just above the jaw. It penetrates his skull. He feels nothing in the way we understand feeling. The neurological damage is instantaneous and catastrophic. The second bullet enters his neck. It damages the spinal structures that connect his brain to the rest of his body. In that fraction of a second, Joe Colombo's body stops being a body that belongs to him. The signals that were going to be sent, to lift his arms, to turn his head, to defend himself, never arrive at their destination. The third bullet strikes somewhere in the upper shoulder and neck region. By the time it lands, Colombo is already falling. The bodyguards beside him have only just begun to register what they are seeing. The crowd, 10 feet behind, has not yet processed the sound. A woman in the third row is still smiling at something her husband said a moment earlier. Joe Colombo hits the pavement. He does not catch himself. His arms do not move. His mouth does not form words. The man who, 90 seconds earlier, had been telling tens of thousands of people that he was the spokesman for an entire ethnic community, now lies on the stone of Columbus Circle in front of all of them, eyes open, blood spreading beneath his head. He is, in every meaningful sense, already gone. His body does not yet know it. The bodyguards have approximately 1 second of confusion before they understand what has happened. In that second, Jerome Johnson is already moving, possibly raising the gun for a 4th shot, possibly turning to flee. The witnesses disagree. What they agree on is what happens next. At least 2 of Colombo's armed associates draw their own handguns and open fire on Johnson at close range. The shots are not careful. They are not aimed. They are the instinctive animal response of trained killers who have just watched their boss go down and have only one priority left: kill the man who did it. immediately before anyone has a chance to ask him anything. Jerome Johnson is hit multiple times. He collapses on the pavement, perhaps 10 feet from Joe Colombo's body. His gun falls from his hand. The camera around his neck lands beside him. Blood pools beneath both men, almost equidistant from the base of the platform, the boss and the killer, dying side by side in the middle of a civil rights rally. In the chaos of the next several minutes, officers and federal agents will move into the killing zone and begin securing weapons. Multiple handguns will be recovered from the scene: Johnson's small handgun, the bodyguard's larger pistols, and possibly other weapons carried by other Colombo associates who never fired, but who had been ready to. The exact number varies by source. What does not vary is this: the response to Johnson was overwhelming, lethal, and immediate. And here is the consequence that will define everything that follows. Jerome Johnson, the only man on earth who could tell investigators who had sent him, if anyone had sent him at all, is dying on the pavement within seconds of pulling the trigger. Johnson, already dead on the pavement, will be pronounced dead on arrival. He will give no interview. He will name no names. He will sign no confession. The truth dies with him. The screams reach the back of the crowd before the news does. Tens of thousands of people who came to a civil rights rally are suddenly in the middle of a public massacre. Some throw themselves to the pavement. Some run toward the stage to see what has happened. Some run away, dragging children by the wrist, looking for any open street that leads out of the circle. Mothers shout for sons they cannot see. Older men cross themselves. This is the moment that no archival footage can fully capture, because the footage we have was shot by men who were themselves running or hiding or stumbling over fallen banners. The historical record gives us images. It gives us angles. It does not give us the experience of being there. The sound of tens of thousands of voices realizing, almost in unison, that the man they had come to cheer was bleeding out on the pavement in front of them. And in the middle of that chaos, a second tragedy is unfolding around Jerome Johnson's body. Some bystanders, seeing only what the cameras saw, a black man with a gun, surrounded by Italian Americans, close in on him. Whether he is beaten by the mob in the aftermath is one of the small unresolved questions of the day. Some later accounts would describe him as having been attacked by the crowd. Decades later, a piece of archival footage would even be miscaptioned online as showing an innocent black man attacked by a mob at the Italian civil rights rally. A caption that would entirely ignore the fact that this innocent-looking man had, 90 seconds earlier, fired 3 bullets into Joe Colombo's head. Officers and federal agents converge on the killing zone within minutes. The area is sealed. Weapons are recovered. Witnesses are pulled aside. The rally, of course, is over. The stage stands empty above the bodies. The microphone, still on, hums quietly into the chaos. Banners still flutter overhead, calling for justice. An ambulance pushes through the edges of the crowd. Paramedics work over Joe Colombo on the pavement. He is unconscious. His pulse is faint. The damage to his brain and spinal column is, even to the untrained eye, catastrophic. They stabilize him as best they can, lift him onto a stretcher, and carry him to the ambulance. His family, his wife, his sons, his closest lieutenants are around him by now. Some climb into the ambulance. Some follow in cars. They will not leave his side for the next 7 years. The ambulance pulls away from Columbus Circle with sirens screaming. It races south through Manhattan toward the nearest emergency room. Reports from the time vary as to which hospital received him first. Later medical records would focus on the long-term care that followed. What is certain is that within 15 to 30 minutes of being shot, Joe Colombo was in surgery. Behind him, Columbus Circle is a crime scene. Jerome Johnson's body lies where it fell. Blood marks the pavement. Banners read Italian American Civil Rights League overhead. Empty chairs, empty stage. A microphone still buzzing. Television crews film the bodies and the police line and the ambulance disappearing down Broadway. The footage will lead the evening news in every market in the country. The surgery saves Joe Colombo's life. That is one way to describe what happens next. The other way to describe it is that the surgery prevents him from dying. Because what comes next, for Joe Colombo, for his family, for the mafia he led, for the federal agencies who had been chasing him, is a stranger and more drawn-out ending than anyone in the crowd could have imagined. For the next 7 years, Joe Colombo will exist. He will not live. He will not die. He will lie in a Brooklyn bedroom, paralyzed and almost completely unable to communicate, while the men who might have wanted him dead either rise, fall, or get killed themselves. That is when the real mystery begins. Joe Colombo survives the emergency surgery. He should not have. The neurological damage from the 3 shots is, by every medical metric, the kind of injury that ends a life within hours. But he survives the operating table. He survives the first night. He survives the first week. And then, against the expectations of his doctors, his family, and the men who paid Jerome Johnson, he keeps surviving. What follows is one of the strangest endings in the history of American organized crime. Joe Colombo, the most public mafia boss in American history, the man who had reinvented himself, will spend those 7 silent years almost completely silent. He is paralyzed. He is, by most accounts, in a near vegetative state. He cannot walk. He cannot speak in any meaningful way. He cannot feed himself. He cannot communicate with the family that surrounds him. He is moved from the hospital to his home in Brooklyn, where his wife and sons and hired caregivers tend to him. The Colombo crime family continues, nominally under his name, in practice run by his lieutenants and his sons, with the commission watching uneasily from the side. He has no input. He has no opinion. He is a name on an organizational chart attached to a body in a bedroom. And while Joe Colombo lies silent, the chain of consequences set off by his shooting begins to consume the men around him. Less than 10 months after Columbus Circle on April 7, 1972, his own 43rd birthday, Joey Gallo is shot and killed at Umberto's Clam House in Little Italy. He is eating with his family. Gunmen walk in. They open fire. Within minutes, Gallo is dead in a pool of blood and clam sauce. Almost every observer of the case agrees on what the killing meant. This was the Colombo family's answer to Columbus Circle. Whether or not Gallo had actually ordered the hit on Joe Colombo, the Colombo family had decided he had, and so he died. But the death of Joey Gallo did not answer the question. It only buried it, because now the only 2 men who could have testified to the truth of what happened at Columbus Circle, Jerome Johnson and Joey Gallo, were both dead, and the 3rd man, Joe Colombo, was alive in name only, locked inside a body that could no longer speak. The police and federal investigators conducted their investigations. Detectives described Johnson as a gun buff and an admirer of Hitler, words that pointed toward an unstable psychology. Perhaps an ideologue, perhaps a man drawn to violence for personal reasons. Some investigators followed the Gallo lead. Some followed the Gambino lead. Some followed leads that went into territory the agencies did not want to publicly discuss. None of it produced a courtroom conviction. None of it produced a clear chain of command. The official file closed with Jerome Johnson as the lone shooter, and every theory beyond him as speculation. The most widely repeated theory is that Joey Gallo, freshly out of prison, hired Jerome Johnson as part of his plan to take control of the Colombo family. The motive fits. The timing fits. Gallo's contacts in the black community, cultivated during his years in prison, could plausibly have produced a young black gunman who would not raise suspicion in the way an Italian-American shooter would. And the Colombo family's swift execution of Gallo less than a year later strongly suggests that this is what they believed. But believed is not proved. No document, no confession, no piece of physical evidence ties Joey Gallo directly to Jerome Johnson. The connection lives in mob law. It does not live in any court file. The second theory points to Carlo Gambino. As the senior boss of the 5 families, Gambino had both the authority and the motive to order Colombo's removal. Every rally Colombo held drew federal attention to the entire underworld. Gambino, who had built his career on invisibility, had reason to want him silenced. and Gambino's style, operating through 3 layers of intermediaries never leaving a trace, would explain why no documentary evidence has ever surfaced. But again, no evidence has surfaced. Just suspicion, motive, and the cold logic of a commission that did not appreciate being upstaged. And then there is the theory that lives at the edges of the case. The theory that the federal government itself, frustrated by an organization it could not legally dismantle, may have had some role in what happened at Columbus Circle. Michael Franzese, a former Colombo family captain who later left the mob, would say in an interview decades later, "To this day, questions remain about who really ordered the hit. Some blame Joey Gallo, others suggested Carlo Gambino. No, it was not Carlo Gambino. Whatever, give him a new identity, it points to the FBI and people remember CIA had involvement. There is no declassified document supporting this. There is no whistleblower. There is only the suspicion repeated inside the underworld for 50 years that no other explanation quite accounts for how cleanly Jerome Johnson got within range, how cleanly he was killed before he could speak, and how completely the investigation closed. In early May 1978, Joe Colombo's condition worsens. He is moved from his Brooklyn home to St. Luke's Hospital in Newburgh, New York, 60 miles north of the city. The official diagnosis is intracerebral problems, meaning in plain language that his brain is finally giving up after 7 years of damage. On May 22, 1978, at the age of 54, Joe Colombo dies. Hospital staff list the cause of death as cardiac arrest. They add in the medical paperwork that the heart failure was brought on by his injury 7 years ago. He did not die at Columbus Circle. It just took 7 years for Columbus Circle to finish killing him. But the story does not end on a Monday in May 1978 in a hospital room in Newburgh, because the question that started at Columbus Circle, who really ordered the death of Joe Colombo and why, is the same question that historians, journalists, and former mobsters are still asking today. And the answer, when you look closely, says more about the city he tried to reinvent himself in than it does about the men who may have pulled the strings. In the years that followed Joe Colombo's shooting and slow death, the family he led ate itself. Internal wars broke out. Captains turned on captains. The league he had built, which had been centered around his charisma, his name, and his money, withered without him. The rallies stopped. The league's chapters dissolved. The federal agencies, which had been forced to remove the word mafia from their press releases during Colombo's peak, quietly put the word back into circulation within a few years. Everything he had built in public was undone in private. Carlo Gambino, the quiet boss who outlived all of them, died of natural causes in his own bed in 1976. 2 years before Colombo finally died in a hospital bed 60 miles upstate. In popular memory, Joe Colombo became a footnote. He is remembered, when he is remembered at all, as the mob boss who started a civil rights movement, a curiosity, a punchline, and anecdote. The complexity of what actually happened at Columbus Circle and what actually happened in those 7 silent years afterward has been flattened into a single sentence. People assume he died that day. People assume Gallo did it. People assume the case was solved. None of those things are true. And there is one detail that more than any other captures how completely the city has chosen to forget what happened in its own center. Today, Columbus Circle is one of the most photographed locations in Manhattan. Tourists pose at the main monument. Cyclists circle the plaza. Glass towers rise on its western edge. Millions of people pass through it every year. And there is no monument. There is no plaque. There is no marker of any kind to indicate that on that exact pavement, on a hot June afternoon in 1971, a mafia boss who had remade himself into a civil rights leader was shot 3 times in the head and neck by a 25-year-old from New Jersey whose true motives have never been explained. The single most baffling, unsolved public shooting in modern American crime history happened on a piece of stone that you can walk across today without knowing anything happened there at all. The city of New York has, in a quiet and complete way, simply chosen to forget. Go back to the image we started with, a summer afternoon in June 1971. Tens of thousands of voices, Italian flags, a 48-year-old man in a dark suit smiling at the largest crowd of his life. He had 90 seconds to live the life he had known. He used it to wave one more time. He used it to walk down a flight of wooden steps. He used it to do what he had decided. Somewhere deep down he had to do, even when his own lieutenants told him not to. Joe Colombo did not die at Columbus Circle, but he ended there. The man who walked off that stage was not the same man who had walked onto it. And the question that he carried, silent and paralyzed, for 7 years in a Brooklyn bedroom, who really decided I had to die, and why did they choose to do it in front of the whole city, is the question we are still trying to answer today. Some murders end with an answer, some murders end with a name, and some murders, like Joe Colombo's, end with a question that simply keeps living long after every person who could have answered it is buried. If you want more deep-dive investigations into the cases history has refused to solve, subscribe to the channel.